The assault on Memphis began just after the sun dipped below the horizon. A hailstorm of flaming arrows descended on the city walls as the siege towers rumbled into position. Soldiers poured forwards, ramming the gates with a deafening crunch of splintering wood. High on the parapets, scrambling into position, the ill-prepared Egyptian archers unleashed volley after volley. But the Assyrian shield-bearers locked together in an impenetrable shell. Arrows pinged uselessly off bronze and leather. In the same manner a small dog may scramble up a fence, the massive warhounds shot up the 30-foot wall in only a few bounds. Reaching the top, their jaws clamped onto ankles and calves, dragging men down into the roiling fray below with sickening screams. Several hounds, 12 feet or approximately 2 men tall, ran at a gallop and at the last second turned their heads to the side and slammed into the gates with their shoulders. Each dog struck with the force of a dozen horses. The large slabs of timber burst into chunks and splinters, collapsing inwards towards the soldiers that were still rushing into position behind them. The Egyptian ranks at the gate didn't last long. The spears and swords that pointed towards the sky at an angle could not hold the dogs at bay. With savage barks that bounced along the stone and sand ground, they tossed their heads to and fro, open mouths and fangs slashing, biting and killing without hesitation. This was battle, an industry the hounds knew better than any other mammal, fish or bird on earth. One Egyptian soldier tried to hide behind a large vase that held a small palm tree. The hound that saw him ensured he never emerged from his place of cowardice. In a few short minutes, hundreds of Egyptian soldiers who had barely mustered to the gates in time were slain. Several dozen hounds stood with paws spread, taking a moment to glance around and ensure that none were left alive. This way, to the palace. The growled command was followed with complete discipline. Kalbi the Alpha had spoken. In the bay, Belu's infiltrators erupted from within hollowed-out ships, slaughtering the rowers before they could grasp their oars. Spears and swords flashed in the morning sun, painting the decks crimson. Some unfortunate souls were flung overboard to thrash and drown. Others met their end in the sharks and crocodiles circling hungrily below. Amidst the chaos, groups of Assyrian sappers stealthily set their explosives, toppling monuments and obliterating entire squadrons of Egyptian infantry beneath massive boulders that flew chaotically through the dark cover of night. Flaming debris rained down across the city like grotesque hail. Inside the walls, all was chaos and flame. Spearmen clashed in desperate street battles while civilians screamed, fleeing the carnage. Stone buildings groaned as they collapsed, reduced to rubble by Assyrian explosions, strategically placed at the key structural points of the largest buildings. Finally, the disciplined ranks surrounded the palace, ram battering the gilded gates. Inside, they cut down opulently dressed nobles and courtiers without mercy, their ornate garb rapidly staining red. Historical priceless artifacts fell lifeless to the polished marble floors, alongside the corpses. The Hounds had planned to completely break the city of Memphis, not just defeat it. And they would not fail.
Pharaoh Taharka stood stoically upon his palace balcony, listening to the symphony of chaos as it began to rise from the besieged city below. The imposing figure of Pharaoh dominated the lavish palace, his presence seeming to radiate divine power. Dark eyes lined with kohl stared intently from beneath his golden headdress, studded with carnelian and lapis lazuli. His brow held the Uraeus serpent, symbol of protection from Ma'at. Smooth ebony skin adorned with gold armbands rippled with muscle, honed by the rigors of shield and spear training. Robes of snow-white Egyptian linen, trimmed in gold and brightly dyed feathers, draped Taharka's powerful frame. The ornate garb marked his supreme status. The sweet aroma of frankincense swirled from braziers as Taharka listened to the court vizier's whispered counsel. He stroked the railing of his balcony pensively, gold rings glinting. Finally, he nodded and clapped twice. The vizier prostrated himself in reverence at the verdict. The pharaoh saw himself as not merely a man, but a living son, who decreed the fate of millions with a gesture. As Taharka stood to do what must be done next, his glittering raiment and unquestioned authority marked him as the very force which set day into motion. And yet he could not stop what his ears were now hearing. Screams mixed with the cruel melody of clashing iron and splintering stone. His Memphis, the glittering jewel of Egypt, was now a smoldering wasteland filled with invaders. Only weeks ago, luxurious barges had drifted down the Nile, laden with tributes from up and down the fertile lands. Now fires raged unchecked, framing the scene below in an infernal glow. This was the work of the Assyrian dogs and their human masters. Taharka ground his teeth bitterly. Arrogance had blinded him until too late. He had celebrated prematurely after crushing them just 3 years prior. Around him, frantic advisors shouted desperate strategies. Reinforce the northern parapets. Summon what ships remain to ferry your lordship upriver. Taharka ignored them. Memphis was lost. He saw that now with chilling clarity. A more artful escape for the one who commanded the sun to rise was required. As dense smoke billowed up from the burning gardens, Taharka descended into the inner sanctums of the palace. The walls here ran thick, enclosing spaces unseen by most mortals. Moving swiftly through the gloom, they entered a small chamber, housing an ornately carved obsidian sarcophagus. With reverence, the pharaoh opened the coffin containing the carefully mummified remains of his father, Piji the Conqueror. If Memphis fell, he could not risk the ascended god-king's remains being desecrated by the Assyrian barbarians. Gently, Taharka lifted the priceless sarcophagus into a cart. Donning a simple hood and robe, he slipped out through the secret passageways, blending into the chaos beyond the palace walls. Like a dark shadow, man and cart wound unnoticed through the ravaged city. None paid heed to one more refugee fleeing the carnage, hiding alone in denial of his shame. As Taharka crossed the last bridge over the Nile, he glanced back one final time. Looted temples burned against the dawn sky. Monuments toppled, bodies strewn like waste across once proud streets, the fruits of his reign gone to ash. Jaw clenched, the pharaoh turned his back on the death of his dynasty. He would have his revenge in time. For now, Survival was paramount. Wheeling his grim cargo north under smoky skies, Taharqa wondered if his father's troubled spirit had cursed him. Perhaps this devastation was cosmic punishment for failing to live up to Paye's towering legacy. The sounds of war slowly faded into the distance behind the fugitive king. But louder still rang the screams of his people, mingled with the terrifying snarls of the Assyrian war dogs who hunted the fleeing palace guard through the ravaged streets. Taharqa would never forget that awful baying which sounded his kingdom's death knell. He whispered a vow to no one in particular. The dogs and their masters would pay in blood if it took his last breath. Memphis would be avenged. By night's end, Memphis was a smoldering wasteland. Crimson canals ran where clean streets had been, fed by the countless bodies of the slain. Surviving citizens huddled in corners, gripped with terror. They flinched as the war dogs growled past. Belu Kalbi and their combined forces had swept through Memphis with calculated fury, annihilating any vestiges of Egyptian rule. Hounds of War is written and produced by James Eldridge. It is a work of fiction. However, in 671 BC, Esarhaddon took and sacked Memphis, where he captured numerous members of the royal family. Although the pharaoh Taharqa had escaped, Esarhaddon captured the pharaoh's family, including his son and wife, and most of the royal court, which was sent back to Assyria as hostages. In an excerpt from the text inscribed on his victory stone, Esarhaddon describes the conquest with the following words.
I slew multitudes of Taharqa's men, and I struck him 5 times with the point of my javelin, with wounds from which there were no recovery. Memphis, his royal city, in half a day. With mines, tunnels, assaults, I besieged, I captured, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire.
But Taharqa was not mortally wounded. He was still very much alive. To see images from this story, or purchase the book in hardcover or Kindle versions, visit houndsofwarbook.com.